The alarm went off at 4:45 a.m., just like it had every day for the last 3 years. Jenny Millers swung her legs out of bed, the cold floor biting against her skin as she reached for the sweater folded neatly on the chair. Her apartment above the old pharmacy was silent except for the hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of pipes warming to life. She moved quietly, out of habit more than necessity. There was no one to wake. Down the 3 flights of stairs and past the shuttered bakery, she walked the same route she always did. 3 blocks, cracked sidewalk, a corner turn by the rusting newspaper dispenser. Rosie's Diner came into view, just as the sky began its shift from black to blue. Its neon sign flickered weakly, more out of habit than function. Jenny unlocked the front door, flipped the open sign with a practiced hand, and breathed in the smell of old coffee and syrup that clung to the booths like memory. She tied her apron around her waist, the fabric faded from hundreds of washes, and began the morning prep. Coffee pots hissed to life. Salt shakers were topped off, menus wiped clean. By 6 a.m., the first regulars shuffled in. Harold always sat at the counter, 3rd stool from the left. Eileen liked the booth near the jukebox but never played a song. Jenny greeted them all with the same warm smile, taking their orders before they even had to speak. She remembered how they liked their eggs, how long they steeped their tea, who needed extra butter without asking. What they didn't know, what no one in the diner really noticed, was that when Jenny smiled, it never quite reached her eyes. They didn't see how her hand lingered on the photograph taped inside her order book, the one of a woman holding a baby on a picnic blanket. They didn't see the way she stood a moment longer by the window when families walked by, or how her gaze sometimes drifted to the table in the far corner, the one no one ever requested. She never talked much about herself. Not because she was hiding anything, but because people rarely asked. And that was fine. Kindness didn't need an audience. She wiped down the counter with care, offered extra creamers without being prompted, and slipped a fresh slice of pie to the elderly couple who shared 1 cup of coffee between them. They always tried to pay for the dessert. She always waved it off. In a town where days blurred together and everyone carried quiet stories beneath their coats, Jenny's presence had become a part of the background. Steady, unobtrusive, quietly necessary. She never expected recognition or reward. But that morning, as she placed a plate of eggs in front of Harold and topped off Eileen's tea, she had no idea that her smallest kindnesses were already changing someone's world. It was a Tuesday morning when Jenny first noticed him, the kind of morning where the sky looked like dishwater and the air carried a bite that hinted at winter's early arrival. She was refilling coffee at the front booth when the bell above the door jingled, sharp and sudden in the lull between rushes. She glanced up out of habit, expecting Harold or one of the high school kids grabbing a quick breakfast. Instead, a boy walked in. He looked no older than 10, maybe younger. Small for his age, with a wiry frame swallowed by a second-hand hoodie and jeans that hung too loose on his legs. A backpack, oversized and patched, tugged at his shoulders like it carried more than books. His shoes were scuffed, laces frayed. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Quiet, alert, and older than they should have been. He didn't wander or hesitate like most kids. He went straight to the corner booth, the one nearest the window and farthest from the door, as if he already knew it would offer the best view of both. Jenny watched as he slid into the seat without a word, pulled a paperback from his bag, and opened it like he'd been there 100 times before. When she approached, notepad in hand, he barely looked up. "Water, please," he said, voice soft but steady. Jenny nodded, something stirring in her chest she couldn't quite name. She brought the glass a minute later with a paper straw, set it gently on the table, and offered him a smile. He didn't return it, but his head dipped in a barely there nod of thanks before he returned to his book. She glanced at the cover, the phantom toll booth, its corners curled like it had weathered many readings. For the rest of the morning, the boy sat quietly, sipping his water in small, deliberate gulps. He didn't look around. He didn't fidget. But she noticed how his eyes flicked up every time a customer walked in, how his shoulders tensed slightly at the sound of footsteps. She recognized that posture. It was the way kids sat in courtrooms or shelters, present, but ready to bolt. At 7:55, just as the diner began to fill with the school-bound rush, the boy closed his book, slid it back into his bag, and walked out the door without a glance back. Jenny stood behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, watching the booth he'd left behind. Empty except for a half-melted straw and a glass of water. She didn't know his name or where he came from, but something about the way he sat alone stayed with her longer than she expected. By Thursday, he was back. Same time, same booth, same quiet entrance, like he was slipping into a space that had been waiting for him. Jenny noticed how he moved, precise, cautious, never hurried. He settled into the corner as if he belonged there, even if his body language said he wasn't sure he did. His book came out again, worn pages flipping under small fingers that handled it with care. This time, it was The Giver. He didn't look at the menu, didn't ask for food, just requested water with that same soft voice and slight nod of thanks. Jenny brought it without comment, setting it on the table with a quiet ease, the way you'd place something for someone you didn't want to startle. She wondered how long he planned to keep this routine going. Just water and words, no breakfast, no conversation. But he came back Friday, and again the following Monday. Always at 7:15, always gone before 8. She began to anticipate him, finding her gaze drifting to the door 5 minutes before his arrival. She told herself it was curiosity, maybe concern, but it was more than that. Something about the boy's quiet presence unsettled the stillness inside her, like watching a reflection you didn't realize was yours. He never brought anyone with him, never checked a phone, didn't fidget or act bored like most kids his age. Just read and sipped water, always slowly, always deliberately. Watching, too. Jenny could feel it. He paid attention in that way kids did when they'd learned early that safety depended on observation. He never looked long at anyone, but his eyes flicked to every movement. The delivery guy stacking boxes, the old man coughing into his sleeve, the couple arguing quietly over burnt toast. And her. Especially her. Jenny began to leave an extra straw with his glass. A napkin folded just so. Nothing obvious, just small gestures to say, "I see you," no questions asked, no judgment. He acknowledged these offerings the same way he always did, with silence, a nod, and that invisible wall that stayed firmly in place between them. By the end of the second week, the pattern was set. 7:15, door chime. 7:16, booth occupied, book opened. 7:17, glass of water delivered by a woman who never asked for anything in return. It wasn't much. A few minutes. A quiet boy. A glass of water. But in the rhythm of Jenny's life, it became something steady. And in the silence he carried, she began to hear echoes of a hunger she remembered all too well. On the 15th morning, Jenny made a decision. The boy had come in like always, quiet, precise, invisible to everyone but her. He took his usual seat, pulled out a wrinkle in time this time, and gave her that slight nod when she placed the water on the table. No smile, no words, just ritual. But something gnawed at Jenny as she watched him from behind the counter. The way his shoulders curved inward a little more than usual. The way his fingers lingered on the edge of the book without turning the page. His eyes didn't scan the text. They hovered above it, distracted. And when a waitress sees a child sit still for 20 minutes without touching the words on a page, She knows something's wrong. She turned to the kitchen pass and quietly asked Kathy to make an extra short stack of pancakes. No rush, no fuss. Kathy raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Jenny had never requested anything off-ticket in all the years she'd worked at Rosie's. A few minutes later, Jenny carried the plate to the boy's booth, setting it down with practiced clumsiness, like it was a mistake. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, voice light. "The kitchen made an extra. I'll just leave it here instead of throwing it away." The boy looked up. His eyes flicked to the pancakes, then to her, then back again. Suspicion flashed across his face, quickly followed by something more difficult to name. Hunger, maybe, tangled with hesitation. "It's okay," Jenny said gently, already stepping back. "Sometimes the cook gets the orders mixed up. Better to eat it than waste it, right?" She walked away before he could respond. Behind the counter, she busied herself stacking cups that didn't need stacking. From the corner of her eye, she watched as the boy sat frozen for a moment, staring at the plate as if it might vanish. Then slowly he reached for the fork. His first bite was tentative, as if testing for traps. The second came quicker. By the third, he was eating with a quiet urgency that broke her heart. He never looked up, never acknowledged her. But 10 minutes later, the plate was empty. When she came by to clear it, he didn't say thank you, not at first. He kept his eyes down, fingers clutching the edges of his book like a shield. But just as she turned away, she heard it, soft, barely audible. "Thank you." She didn't look back, didn't nod, just walked away, letting the weight of those two words settle deep in her chest. It was the first thing he'd said beyond "water, please," in 15 days. And it was enough. After that morning, something shifted, not in any obvious way, but in the space between moments, in the way rituals are born out of need and kindness. The next day, Jenny didn't wait for a sign or excuse. She just brought scrambled eggs and toast to the booth at 7:20. No pretense this time, no faked kitchen error. She set the plate down as if it had been ordered, added a small bottle of hot sauce on the side, and walked away without a word. The boy didn't question it. He simply ate, slowly at first, then with the quiet desperation of someone learning to pace their hunger for fear of losing it too quickly. When he finished, he opened his book again, his face unreadable. But as she cleared the empty plate, he whispered it once more. "Thank you." And so it began. Each morning, Jenny prepared a new plate, a rotating menu of whatever the kitchen could spare. Pancakes with a pat of butter, oatmeal with brown sugar when the mornings turned cold. French toast one day, plain and golden, never too much, just enough. He never asked for anything, and Jenny never explained why she kept bringing it. It was simply understood. A silent agreement, as natural and unspoken as the rising sun. The boy arrived at exactly 7:15. He would sit, read, and wait. Jenny would bring food within 5 minutes, always with a full glass of water and an extra napkin. They never chatted. He never looked up when she placed the plate down, and she never lingered. But he always said thank you before he left. Quiet, small, but sincere. Sometimes he'd even glance up just long enough to meet her eyes for a second, before slipping his book into his bag and heading out the door. It was the smallest ritual, invisible to most. But for Jenny, it became the most important part of her day. She found herself thinking ahead to what he might like, saving portions from early prep or convincing Kathy to fry up just one more egg. She adjusted her morning rhythm around him without even realizing it. He never told her his name, never explained why he was alone. But Jenny didn't ask. She recognized the shape of his silence. It mirrored something inside her, something that didn't need words to be understood. In that space between his arrival and departure, they created something sacred. A connection rooted not in conversation, but in consistency, in trust built slowly, one meal at a time. And in a world that so often demanded explanations, Jenny gave him what few did: space, warmth, and the dignity of not having to ask. By the third week, people started to notice. Kathy was the first. She didn't say much at first, just raised an eyebrow when she saw Jenny preparing a plate of bacon and toast without a ticket. But on a slow Tuesday, while wiping down the counter, she leaned in close and said it without malice, just matter of fact. "You're feeding a stray, you know." Jenny didn't look up from where she was pouring syrup into a glass bottle. "He's a kid." "Still a stray," Kathy replied. "Strays don't stay. You feed them once, they keep coming. You make it a habit, they disappear the moment you start to care." Jenny just shrugged. She knew Kathy wasn't trying to be cruel. She'd seen enough in her life to expect the worst and call it realism. But Jenny wasn't ready to stop. Later that week, Harold noticed too. He tapped the rim of his coffee mug and gestured with his chin toward the corner booth. "Who's the kid?" he asked. "He yours." Jenny smiled faintly. "Just someone who comes in for breakfast." Harold snorted. "Without paying?" "He eats, that's enough." Harold didn't press, but he made a face that said he didn't agree. It wasn't the last one she'd see. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder. Small-town diners didn't thrive on mystery. They ran on routine and predictable faces. And a quiet boy with no parents in sight and a steady supply of hot meals was anything but predictable. "You playing charity worker on company time now," muttered a businessman one morning, more amused than angry. Jenny ignored him, focusing on the coffee pot in her hand. The comments trickled in like leaky faucets. Never direct, never confrontational. Just enough to sting. But it was when Mark, the diner's manager, finally pulled her aside in the back office that she knew the quiet was over. His tie was crooked, his brow shiny from stress. "Jenny," he said, tone serious. "I've been watching. This kid—" "I'll pay for the meals," she cut in, folding her arms. "From your tips." He shook his head. "They barely cover your rent." "It's my choice." Mark studied her. There was something in her voice, firm, tired, final, that stopped him from pushing further. "Fine," he muttered. "But if it becomes a problem, it won't." He didn't say anything else, just nodded and let her go. Back at the counter, Jenny refilled the boy's water without speaking. The pancakes were already waiting. He looked up, and this time, his eyes held hers a second longer. Not fear, not suspicion, just acknowledgement. That was all she needed. Jenny had worked around people long enough to know when not to ask. Curiosity was a luxury, and for some, answering even the simplest question could feel like standing in front of a firing squad. The boy never offered his name, and Jenny never pushed for it. He came, he ate, he whispered thank you, and he left. That was the rhythm, that was the agreement. Most kids craved attention, light conversation, compliments about school or their favorite subjects. But not him. He moved like someone who had learned to make himself small, to stay quiet and unseen. He didn't laugh, didn't linger. Every gesture seemed calculated, not in a manipulative way, but in the way of someone trying not to tip a delicate balance. She watched how he sat, always facing the door, eyes flicking to the window every time someone walked by. He never turned his back to the room. That kind of awareness wasn't natural in children. It was earned, learned through experience. Jenny understood more than she wanted to. When she was 15, her world had flipped overnight. One minute she was living in a trailer with 2 working parents. The next, she was standing in a funeral home in shoes that didn't fit, surrounded by people who kept using the word accident like it explained everything. That was the first time she'd learned to be quiet, too. So when the boy arrived each morning, silent, alert, alone, she didn't see a mystery to be solved. She saw a child surviving. One day, as she cleared his plate, she found a corner of notebook paper folded beneath the fork. At first, she thought it was trash, but when she opened it, she found a sketch, a pencil drawing of the diner's window, the booths outlined with care, the glass reflecting the early sun. It wasn't signed. There were no words, just the drawing, left behind like a breadcrumb. She didn't mention it, didn't ask. The next morning, she tucked a pencil and a small blank pad into the side of his table, beside the usual glass of water and stack of pancakes. He didn't say a word when he saw it. Just opened the pad, flipped to the first page, and began to draw. Still no name. Still no story. But something had shifted. In a world obsessed with explanations, Jenny chose to offer something different. Quiet understanding. The kind that said, you don't have to explain yourself to be worth caring about. The morning felt wrong before the sun even rose. Jenny woke before her alarm, a faint unease tugging at the edges of her thoughts. She couldn't explain it, couldn't name it, but it clung to her shoulders like damp air. She walked to the diner with her hands shoved deep in her coat pockets, head down against the wind, eyes scanning the sidewalk out of habit. She opened Rosie's like always, lights on, coffee brewing, chairs down, floors swept. The early regulars filtered in one by one, their routines as predictable as clockwork. But at 7:15, the bell above the door didn't ring. No soft footfalls, no oversized backpack, no quiet nod of greeting. Jenny glanced at the corner booth. Empty. Not just unoccupied, but somehow more vacant than usual. The air around it felt still, untouched. She kept moving, telling herself not to read too much into it. Maybe he overslept. Maybe he was sick. Maybe the weather turned, or the school schedule shifted. Kids miss days. It doesn't mean anything. Still, at 7:20, she made his usual plate. 2 pancakes, not too much syrup. She placed it gently on the table beside the glass of water, napkin folded just the way he liked. Then she walked away, pretending her heart wasn't beating just a little too fast. The plate sat untouched. Customers came and went, oblivious to the quiet tension wrapped around that one booth. Jenny stole glances throughout the morning, each time hoping to see him slip in quietly, brush snow off his shoulders, slide into the seat like nothing had happened. But the seat stayed cold. The pancakes grew cold too. Kathy passed by and shook her head. He's not coming, Jen. Jenny didn't answer. She couldn't. She just kept wiping down already clean counters, pouring coffee for people who never noticed the empty booth and the plate that sat like an open question. By the end of her shift, the pancakes had stiffened. She couldn't bring herself to throw them out. Instead, she wrapped them carefully in foil and took them home, tucking the bundle into her fridge like a forgotten promise. That night, as she stared at the still wrapped plate, a quiet sadness settled over her. She didn't know why his absence hurt. She hadn't known his name, hadn't known his story. But in the rituals they shared, the meals, the silence, the thank yous, something real had taken root. And now, it was missing. By the third day, Jenny stopped pretending it didn't bother her. She still made his breakfast, lighter meals now, just in case, but each morning the plate sat untouched. The booth stayed empty, the corner by the window somehow dimmer, lonelier. At first, she kept telling herself he'd be back. Maybe he was sick. Maybe something small had changed. Kids disappeared and reappeared all the time. But as the days passed, that fragile hope began to thin. Kathy watched her place another untouched plate at the booth on Friday morning and sighed. You know he's not coming back, right?" Jenny didn't respond. She just kept setting the napkin, folding it carefully like always. It felt important, like preserving the space meant preserving the boy himself. The regulars started to notice too. Harold looked toward the booth as he stirred his coffee. "Haven't seen your little friend lately." Jenny forced a small smile. "Me neither." People began to ask more questions. Where'd he go? Did she ever know who he was? Was he a runaway? A scam? There was speculation, and then there was judgment, quiet and creeping, like mold beneath tile. Some suggested Jenny had imagined the whole thing. Others said she'd been conned. He'd probably had a warm home all along and just wanted free food. A man at table 5 muttered something about naive kindness, and people like her never learning. Jenny overheard it. She didn't flinch. But something deeper gnawed at her. Guilt, maybe, or helplessness. The sense that she'd missed a sign, that the boy's silence had been a message she hadn't known how to read. And now, whatever he'd been protecting himself from had finally caught up. A part of her had started looking for him everywhere. On the sidewalk as she walked to work, in the backs of passing cars, in the crowd of children spilling from the elementary school 3 blocks away. She hadn't realized how much space he'd taken up in her thoughts until he was gone. By the 7th day, someone snapped a photo of the empty booth. It popped up on a local Facebook group with a sarcastic caption, "Rosie's Diner, still serving invisible customers with taxpayer eggs." The post went mildly viral, mostly for laughs. But the comments stung. People mocked the idea of feeding strangers, questioned Jenny's sanity, spun conspiracy theories out of eggs and toast. Jenny read the thread once. Then she turned off her phone. That night she sat in her apartment with the wrapped pancakes still untouched in her fridge, and for the first time, she wondered if Kathy had been right. Maybe strays really didn't stay. Maybe the boy had vanished the same way he came, quiet, without explanation, leaving nothing behind but an ache that didn't know where to land. It started with a single photo, a quick snap taken on someone's phone without permission, shared with a snide comment meant to get a few laughs. The image showed the corner booth, empty as always, a plate of untouched pancakes and a full glass of water sitting like relics from a ghost meal. The caption read, "Rosie's Diner, now serving imaginary charity cases. Hope the invisible kid leaves a tip." By lunchtime, it had been shared dozens of times. By evening, hundreds. The town's small online community swelled with opinions, most of them cruel. Jenny didn't even know it had gone viral until a teenager from the dinner rush asked if the ghost breakfast was still on the menu. At first, she brushed it off. She'd been mocked before, for being too quiet, for being too kind, for not knowing when to stop caring. But as the day wore on, the comments worsened. "Publicity stunt. Bet she's doing it for attention. Sad woman feeding invisible kids to feel important. These bleeding hearts always want praise for wasting food." There were jokes about mental health, comments accusing her of lying. One user wrote that people like her created dependency and kept kids weak. Another said she was probably pocketing tips under the guise of charity. Jenny didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just turned the sign to "closed" that night a little slower than usual and cleaned the booth with a care that bordered on reverence. She wrapped the untouched pancakes and placed them in the cooler, same as every other day. Her hands moved steadily, but inside, something trembled. Alone in her apartment, the glow of her phone still lit the corner of the table. She opened the post again, just once. Scrolled through the comments, felt each line like a scrape. The cruelest ones weren't the loudest. They were the ones that pretended to be reasonable. The ones that questioned whether kindness without proof had value, whether helping someone without knowing their story was foolish. Was it? Jenny looked at the sketch the boy had left behind, now framed beside her small mirror. The pencil lines were fading, but the intention behind them hadn't. That quiet connection they'd shared didn't need to be defended. But in the face of ridicule, it felt suddenly fragile. She placed her phone face down and reached for the box beneath her bed, the one that held old letters and her father's journal, written in the same looping hand he'd had in the army. She flipped to a page she knew by heart, the one that reminded her that kindness done in silence was still kindness, that helping someone even once mattered. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them forget. She wouldn't. The noise from the world outside couldn't touch her here. Jenny sat on the floor of her apartment, legs crossed, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. In front of her sat a worn wooden box, smooth from years of handling, its brass latch loose from being opened too many times. She hadn't touched it in months, not since her last quiet night of needing her father more than she could admit. She unlatched the box with care, lifting the lid as if waking something sacred. Inside were the pieces of him she'd kept, the dog tags, a photograph of him in uniform with that steady, calm smile, and the old leather-bound journal he'd carried through his deployment. The pages were yellowed at the edges, the ink faded in places, but it still smelled faintly of dust and oil and memory. She flipped past pages of logistical notes and sketches, searching for one passage, dog-eared from years of revisiting. Her fingers stopped when she saw the entry dated June 12th, scribbled in slanted handwriting that had always looked like it was racing ahead of itself. Shared a half ration with a local boy today. Johnson said I was crazy, that the kid would probably run off and tell someone where we were camped. Maybe. But the look in his eyes when he ate, it was the same look I had when Mom saved me the last piece of bread during the lean years. No one grows poor by sharing half a loaf, but those who forget to share, they stay hungry in ways that food can't fix. Jenny ran her fingers over the words, her throat tightening. She could still hear his voice in the cadence of the sentences, still remember the way he'd read bits of it to her when she was a teenager, desperate to understand why he gave so much of himself to others. He'd never called it heroism. He'd called it survival, humanity, simple decency. She leaned back against the wall, the journal open in her lap. The noise online, the jeering faces, the pointed comments. They weren't new. The world had always had a sharp edge for people who acted without asking for credit. Her father had known it. He'd still given the food, still extended the hand. Not for applause, not even for thanks, but because sometimes someone was hungry, and you were the one holding the bread. Jenny closed the journal slowly, holding it to her chest like a lifeline. In the booth by the window, she hadn't just been serving breakfast. She'd been remembering her father, carrying forward the best part of him in small, quiet acts of care. Let the world misunderstand, mock, twist it into something it wasn't. She knew what it really was, and that was enough. The laughter didn't stop the next day, or the day after that. The online post kept circulating, passed from one screen to another, like a bad joke that refused to die. Customers whispered, some openly stared. A few made snide remarks within earshot, pretending not to look when Jenny turned to wipe the counter with a steady hand. But the pancake still made it to the corner booth. Every morning, 7:15 sharp, she placed a plate there, sometimes oatmeal with cinnamon when the air carried a chill, sometimes eggs and toast with a single slice of orange. She folded the napkin, refilled the water glass, and walked away like it was any other table. No announcement, no explanation, just quiet consistency. No one joined her in the ritual, but she noticed the silence changed. The harshest whispers became fewer. Some regulars, the ones who'd muttered about handouts, started watching with something like guilt in their eyes. No one apologized, but the way they stopped talking when she passed said enough. Mark never brought it up again. though she caught him lingering at the kitchen door a few times, eyes drifting to the boy's booth before returning to the grill. Kathy didn't make any more stray comments. She simply watched and shook her head like someone who didn't understand, but had decided not to stand in the way. Jenny didn't know why she kept doing it. She just knew she had to. It wasn't about hope anymore. It wasn't about waiting for him to walk through the door. It was about the space he'd left behind and honoring it. It was about defying the notion that kindness only mattered when someone was watching. So she served the meals, cleared the untouched plates, and took them home when she couldn't bear to throw them away. The wrapped leftovers lined her fridge like little gravestones for a presence that once mattered. But she kept setting the table. Because maybe the boy wasn't gone. Maybe he was just lost for a little while. Maybe he was still out there, holding on by a thread, needing to believe that someone still made a place for him in the world. And if he ever came back, even just once, Jenny wanted him to see that nothing had changed, that someone remembered, that a seat was still his. The 23rd day began like all the others, but Jenny felt the weight of it the moment she opened her eyes. There was no reason this day should have felt heavier than the last, and yet something about the number made it stick, almost a full month. 23 mornings of silence, of a plate returned untouched, of hoping, then doubting, then bracing herself against both. She walked to the diner in the dim gray of early morning, her boots crunching softly against the frost-hardened sidewalk. The town hadn't changed. The bakery still opened at 6. The bus still passed by the corner stop at 7:10. But inside Jenny, something had shifted. Hope had begun to sour into something more brittle, something closer to grief. She went through the motions as always, lights on, coffee brewing, napkin bins refilled. But when she cracked the eggs, she found her hands trembling just slightly, the shell slipping from her grip, yolk bleeding onto the counter. She cursed softly under her breath and cleaned it up with more care than necessary. At 7:10, her eyes went to the window. A habit now, reflex. She watched the sidewalk, counting steps, scanning faces. A mailman, a jogger, a mother pulling a small child by the hand, both bundled against the cold. No boy. Still, at 7:15, she set the table. French toast today, golden, sprinkled lightly with powdered sugar. A little syrup in a ceramic dish, a folded napkin and a glass of water that caught the early light like a promise. She placed the plate at his booth, pausing just a second longer than usual, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. Then she walked away, the echo of her steps louder in the quiet than she liked. The diner filled with the usual noise, cutlery clinking, low conversations, the occasional burst of laughter. Jenny served her tables, took orders, poured coffee, all while her gaze returned again and again to the untouched plate. By 8 o'clock, the toast had cooled, the water glass had fogged, and still the seat remained empty. She cleared it like she always did, carefully, without ceremony. But as she wrapped the leftovers in foil, her breath caught for a moment in her throat. She wasn't sure what she felt anymore. Disappointment, guilt, sadness, something harder to name. She only knew one thing with certainty. His absence was no longer just a gap in her morning. It was a presence of its own, a shadow that moved beside her, quiet and constant. And still, she told herself, she'd make the plate tomorrow, just in case. The morning was like any other, until it wasn't. Jenny had just poured Harold's second cup of coffee when the diner fell abruptly silent, like the air had thickened all at once. Conversations stopped. Silverware paused mid-air. Even the old jukebox in the corner seemed to hold its breath. Outside, through the streaked front windows, 4 black SUVs rolled into the parking lot in perfect, unsettling sync. They parked in a wide arc, forming a quiet blockade around the front of Rosie's. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just presence, heavy and unmistakable. The first door opened, and a man in uniform stepped out. Tall, rigid posture, the kind that couldn't be unlearned. Then another, and another. All of them wore dark coats with subtle but clear military insignia. Their faces were unreadable, their movements precise. Jenny stood behind the counter, coffee pot still in hand, watching as the lead vehicle opened and a man in full military dress stepped onto the pavement. His chest bore rows of ribbons and medals that caught the weak morning light like fire. He wore his cap low, eyes scanning the diner with purpose, not curiosity. The bell above the door jingled, soft, almost absurdly delicate compared to what was unfolding. Mark came out from the back, wiping his hands on a towel, clearly rattled. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice catching halfway through the sentence. The officer removed his cap, revealing silver-streaked hair and a face weathered by years of command. "We're looking for someone," he said evenly. "Jenny Miller's." Every eye in the room turned. Jenny felt the world narrow around her, as if everything had tilted slightly. Her hands felt distant, the coffee pot heavier than it should have been. She stepped out from behind the counter slowly. "That's me," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. The officer gave her a long look, not cold, not harsh, just serious. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a crisp envelope sealed with an official insignia. "I'm Colonel David Reeves, United States Army Special Forces Command," he said. "And I'm here because of a promise made to one of our own." He extended the envelope toward her, but Jenny didn't take it. Not yet. Her eyes flicked between him, the soldiers behind him, the envelope, the stunned faces of the diners. Nothing made sense. The moment felt too big, too sudden. Colonel Reeves's voice softened just slightly. "This is about the boy, the one you fed." Jenny's heart stuttered. For a split second, she thought she'd misheard him. But no, he had said the boy. And in that instant, everything changed. Jenny stood frozen, the envelope still extended between them, untouched. Around her, the diner felt impossibly still. Forks lowered, coffee cooled. The quiet stretched thin, like glass about to shatter. Colonel Reeves cleared his throat, voice steady but weighted. "The boy's name is Adam. Adam Thompson. He's 10 years old." Jenny blinked. The name landed like a pebble dropped in a deep well, echoing but still distant. "He's the son of Master Sergeant James Thompson," the colonel continued, "one of the finest soldiers I've ever served with. Deployed overseas 3 months ago." Jenny's breath caught. "Before he left," the colonel said, "Sergeant Thompson made arrangements, emergency funds, neighbors keeping an eye. But what he didn't know was that Adam's mother left soon after deployment. Vanished. No note, no call. Just gone." The room, already quiet, grew impossibly still. Even Kathy in the kitchen had stepped into the hallway, her arms folded tightly, lips pressed together. "Adam didn't tell anyone," the colonel went on, his voice softening. "Didn't want to be taken from his home. Didn't want to be a burden. So he managed on his own. Lived in that house, walked to school, stretched what little food he had." Jenny felt her chest tighten, her throat closing around something thick and wordless. "He told no one," Reeves repeated. "No teachers, no neighbors, no friends. But he did write letters to his father every week. Told him about school, the weather, the corner booth at the diner." He looked at her then, eyes gentler now. "You," he said. "He wrote about you." Jenny's hands trembled. "He never mentioned your name, just called you the lady at the diner. Said you never asked questions, never treated him like a problem, just brought him food every day like he was supposed to be there." The colonel opened the envelope slowly and withdrew a single handwritten page. The paper was creased, the ink slightly smudged. "This letter," he said, lifting it carefully, "was found among Sergeant Thompson's personal effects. He died 6 weeks ago during an operation in Afghanistan. In his final instructions, he asked that if anything happened to him, we find you." Jenny felt the words crack through her like lightning. "Find the woman who fed my son," the colonel read aloud, voice faltering for just a moment. "Tell her she gave him dignity when he had none left. Tell her she didn't just feed a hungry boy. She protected a soldier's child." Tears welled in Jenny's eyes, hot and fast, but she didn't move to wipe them. She just stood there, her heart full of sorrow, pride, and something deeper, an understanding. She hadn't known his name, his story, his pain, but none of it had mattered. And now she knew. Kindness, even offered in silence, had echoed across oceans. Colonel Reeves held the letter with both hands, the weight of it evident in the way his voice dipped into reverence. Jenny could see the faint smudges along the creases, as if it had been opened and refolded too many times by hands trying to hold something that was already slipping away. "This was the last letter Master Sergeant Thompson wrote before his final operation," he said. "He entrusted it to me with instructions to carry out its request, no matter the outcome." He glanced at Jenny, then began to read, each word carved in clarity. "To whom it may concern, if this letter finds you, I did not return. And if that is the case, there is something I need you to do for me, something that matters more than any medal I've earned or mission I've completed. Find the woman at Rosie's diner. My son, Adam, wrote about her in every letter, said she never asked him why he was alone, never looked at him like he was broken, just brought him breakfast like he mattered. He told me she made the pancakes a little differently each day, that she remembered how he liked his water, that she smiled without asking for anything. My son, who barely spoke at school, wrote entire paragraphs about her. Not about what she said, but about how she made him feel. Safe, seen, normal." Jenny's eyes blurred. She could hear the breath catching in the chests around her, but everything had narrowed to the colonel's voice and the paper trembling gently in his hands. "She fed him when I couldn't. Loved him in the quiet way people do when they've known their own hunger. Not just the kind you feel in your stomach, but the kind that hollows out your heart. Tell her this. She didn't just give my son food. She gave me peace in my final days. Knowing someone out there saw my boy and treated him with dignity, that was the only thing that let me close my eyes at night. She saved him. And in doing that, she saved me too. Please find her. Tell her thank you. From a father who couldn't come home." Silence fell after the last word. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that filled a room with weight and warmth all at once. Jenny stood rooted in place, tears slipping down her cheeks unchecked, her hands gripping the counter behind her, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The colonel stepped forward and placed the letter into her hands. "You mattered," he said gently. "To a boy who had nothing, to a father who gave everything." Jenny looked down at the letter, the ink faded but permanent. She hadn't asked for thanks, but standing there, letter pressed to her chest, she realized it wasn't just gratitude being handed to her. It was trust, legacy, and love. Jenny didn't remember setting the letter down. Her hands had gone numb, her mind suspended somewhere between disbelief and emotion too large for words. Around her, the diner remained hushed, the low hum of the refrigerator now the loudest sound in the room. No clinking silverware, no conversation. Just eyes, wide, stunned, fixed on her. Colonel Reeves took one step back, then straightened to his full height. In one precise motion, he raised his hand in a formal salute. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't showy, it was reverent. Behind him, The other uniformed men followed, boots clicking against the worn diner tiles, backs straight, eyes solemn. Every man and woman in uniform saluted her, not as a gesture of politeness, but of honor, of recognition, for what she'd done without a name, without permission, without praise. Jenny stood frozen, apron still tied around her waist, her fingertips stained with coffee. She wasn't dressed for ceremony. Her hair was in a loose braid. There was a smudge of syrup on her sleeve. But it didn't matter. Not to them. Harold slowly rose from his stool. Eileen stood, napkin clutched in one hand, tears in her eyes. One by one, every diner customer followed suit. Chairs scraped softly across the floor as they stood, not in confusion, but in quiet awe. Kathy stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, blinking rapidly. Mark, the manager who once worried about wasted eggs and profit margins, took off his cap and held it over his chest. No one said a word. They didn't have to. The woman they'd once dismissed as a background fixture in their daily routine now stood at the center of something far larger than any of them had imagined. She hadn't fought in a war. She hadn't worn a badge or a uniform, but she had shown up every morning and chosen compassion over convenience, kindness over questions. Colonel Reeves lowered his salute and stepped closer. "On behalf of the United States Army Special Forces," he said, voice steady but thick with meaning. "On behalf of Master Sergeant James Thompson, and most importantly, on behalf of Adam, we thank you." Jenny tried to speak, but no sound came. She only nodded, eyes glassy, lips trembling. Sometimes the world doesn't notice the quiet people, the ones who show up, do good, and disappear back into their corners without seeking applause. But that morning, in a small-town diner between a hardware store and a laundromat, everyone saw her. And for the first time, they saw what kindness, steady, unseen, and uncelebrated, was truly worth. The story spread like morning sun breaking over a stormy night, slow at first, then all at once. By the next day, the town was buzzing. The diner hadn't seen so many customers in years. The same people who had once whispered about feeding strays now arrived early, hovering near the booth where Adam had once sat, their voices hushed, respectful. The plaque Mark installed overnight, reserved for those who serve and the families who wait, gleamed softly beneath the American flag he'd tacked to the wall above it. Jenny moved through her shift as always, refilling mugs, jotting orders, wiping tables. But something was different. People looked at her now, not through her, not past her, at her, and not with suspicion or quiet judgment, with gratitude. Harold, who once scoffed at the boys' silent visits, now left a $20 tip with a scribbled note. "Thanks for reminding me what matters." Eileen brought a bouquet of sunflowers wrapped in butcher paper and said nothing, just placed them gently on the counter beside the register. Even the man who had mocked her online, the one who'd posted the photo of the empty booth, returned. He stood awkwardly by the counter, holding a small white envelope. "I, didn't know," he said, voice low. "I was wrong." Jenny didn't say anything. She just nodded, accepting the envelope. Inside was a handwritten apology and a check made out to Rosie's Diner, Emergency Meal Fund. The Facebook post that had once mocked her was replaced by another, this time written by a local teacher. It told Adam's story, quoted the letter from his father, and ended with a single sentence that pierced through cynicism like a pin through fabric. She didn't ask his name. She just made sure he wasn't hungry. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. The diner's phone began to ring. First, the local paper, then the state news. Veterans called in to offer their thanks. Strangers from across the country donated through an impromptu fundraiser started by a group of army wives. Someone mailed in a handmade quilt with embroidered patches from every branch of the military. Jenny didn't seek the attention. If anything, she shied away from it. But she welcomed the change in tone, the softening of voices, the shift from judgment to reverence. People who once asked, "Why would you feed someone you don't know?" began asking, "How can we help?" In a town that once ridiculed a waitress for doing too much, kindness had finally become contagious. And Jenny, still in her apron, still smiling softly behind the counter, knew this. She hadn't changed. The world had. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday, tucked in a manila envelope with no return address, the handwriting on the front small and careful. Jenny recognized it before she even opened it. The same precise strokes she'd once glimpsed on notebook pages folded beneath forks. Her heart clenched as she slid a finger beneath the seal and unfolded the lined paper inside. "Dear Miss Jenny, I didn't know your name until the day the colonel came to the diner. I never asked because I didn't want you to ask mine. I was scared. I thought if anyone knew I was alone, they'd take me away. But you never asked anything. You just brought me pancakes and eggs and oatmeal with brown sugar on cold mornings. You remembered my water and the extra napkin, and you always smiled like I wasn't a problem. I wanted to say thank you, not just for the food, but for letting me be invisible when I needed to be, and seen when I didn't know how to ask for it." Jenny paused, her fingers trembling, her eyes already wet. "Grandma and Grandpa are nice. They live in Colorado. There's a lake nearby, and Grandpa says he'll teach me how to fish when it gets warmer. I started a new school. It's different, but not bad. I don't look over my shoulder as much anymore. I still miss Dad. Sometimes it hurts so much I can't breathe. But I think he'd be happy I'm okay. He used to say real heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear aprons and carry coffee pots. I think he meant you." Jenny pressed the letter to her chest for a moment, then continued reading through blurry eyes. "The colonel said you never asked for thanks. But I wanted to say it anyway. Thank you for not asking me why I was alone. Thank you for not treating me like I was broken. You were the only part of my day that felt normal. Sometimes I think you knew more than you let on. If you did, thank you for letting me pretend I was just a kid having breakfast. I finished that book I was reading, the one I always had with me. It had a happy ending. I hope yours does too. Your friend, Adam Thompson." Jenny didn't frame the letter for the world to see. She tucked it gently into the pocket of her order pad, close to her heart, where she could carry it through the long shifts and heavy days. Not as proof, not as pride, but as a reminder that quiet kindness, given without expectation, could echo across lives. And sometimes it comes back in the form of a thank you from a boy who finally found the words. The morning after Jenny received Adam's letter, she arrived at the diner earlier than usual. The rain had cleared, leaving the sidewalks damp and shining in the pale light. She carried the letter in her pocket, its weight light but meaningful, tucked close like a secret she wasn't quite ready to share. Mark was already inside, tinkering with the old radio behind the counter, pretending not to notice her red eyes or the tired edge in her voice. But when she walked toward the boys' booth, she stopped short. Something was different. A small engraved plaque had been mounted discreetly above the seat back. The wood still smelled faintly of varnish, freshly sanded and placed with care. Jenny leaned in to read the inscription, "Reserved for those who serve and the families who wait." It was simple, unadorned, but perfect. Above the plaque, an American flag hung from the wall, not oversized or theatrical, just present, just right. And beside it, tucked in a narrow frame, was a copy of the sketch Adam had once left behind. The same one she used to keep behind the counter. Mark must have taken it, quietly, like he always did things that mattered, without asking, without making a scene. Jenny stood there for a long moment, one hand on the back of the booth, her thumb brushing the edge of the plaque. It felt like a grave marker and a celebration at once, a tribute to what had happened in silence, now made permanent for the world to see. As the day wore on, customers began to notice. Some asked about the new sign, others simply nodded when they saw it. Veterans who passed through town began requesting that table. Families sat there quietly, often with young children, their voices low, their glances respectful. No one took selfies. No one treated it like a novelty. They just sat, ate, remembered. Jenny never turned anyone away from the booth, but she always kept one hand on it, figuratively, if not always literally. She made sure the napkins were folded, the silverware laid gently, the condiments stocked just right. It was still a booth, still just wood and vinyl and light, but it was more than that now. It was a promise. To the boy who'd sat there every morning, carrying a secret too heavy for his years. To his father, who died with faith in a stranger's quiet kindness. And to everyone else who might walk in hungry for more than food. The booth would remain his, and theirs. Always. It started with a single coin. A man in uniform came in one morning, early and quiet, the kind of customer who knew how to take up little space. He asked for black coffee and sat at the reserved booth without hesitation, as if he understood exactly where he was. Jenny served him without comment, but when she returned to clear the table, he had already gone. In his place, resting beside the empty mug, was a small challenge coin, brass, worn, with the insignia of the 82nd Airborne engraved on one side and the words, "All the Way," on the other. She picked it up gently, the cool weight familiar but new, and held it in her hand for a long time. The next week, another one appeared, this one left by a Marine in dress blues, passing through on his way to a funeral. A week later, it was a patch from a National Guard unit in Louisiana. Then a Navy pin. Then another coin, Special Forces again, but this one with custom etching. To those who serve beyond the battlefield. Word had spread, not through newspapers or headlines, but through the oldest, strongest method the military knew, word of mouth. Across bases, barracks, deployment zones, someone always knew someone who had heard about the woman in the small Kansas diner who fed a soldier's son without knowing who he was. Soon, the small bulletin board behind the counter was no longer used for shift schedules or pie specials. Mark cleared it entirely and hung a clean corkboard in its place. On it, they pinned each patch, each coin, each insignia with care. It wasn't showy, it wasn't meant to be, but customers noticed. Veterans stopped and stared. Young recruits took photos with quiet reverence. Occasionally, one would step forward, remove a patch from their own sleeve, and pin it to the board themselves, saying nothing as they did. Some left handwritten notes folded and tucked in the corners. "My kid's name is Adam, too. Thank you for seeing him. My mom was a waitress. She would have done the same. Because of you, I called home today." Jenny never asked them to leave anything. She never expected thanks. But each token felt like a piece of Adam's story scattering into the world, carried by people who understood hunger, not just for food, but for comfort, for home, for the small things that kept you going. One afternoon, she stood in front of the board alone, eyes tracing the collage of gratitude. Her fingers rested on a coin engraved with the words Semper Fidelis. Always faithful, and she was, to a boy, to a memory, to a promise that had traveled farther than she ever imagined. The idea came not from Jenny, but from a customer. An older woman, silver hair tucked beneath a wool hat, left a note with her receipt one morning. Jenny found it while clearing the table. If I paid for one kid's breakfast each week, could you make sure it goes to someone like Adam?" Tucked beneath the note was a folded $20 bill. Jenny stared at it for a long moment, heart swelling with something close to awe. It wasn't just about Adam anymore. It was about all the children who walked through life quietly hungry for food, for safety, for someone to notice. She showed the note to Mark that afternoon, half expecting a sigh or a logistical concern. Instead, he nodded slowly, then walked into his office and returned with a dusty donation jar from an old pie fundraiser. They cleaned it, added a new label, Adam's Table for Kids of Deployed Heroes, and placed it at the register. Jenny wasn't sure anyone would notice, but by the end of the week, the jar was full. Word spread quickly. A retired Army wife called to donate a month's worth of breakfasts. A teacher dropped off a grocery gift card with a post-it that read, "For the quiet kids in the corner." The diner's social media, once used only to announce seasonal specials, became a space for updates, thank yous, and photos of the board now overflowing with coins and patches. With help from a local accountant, Mark set up a small fund, modest but official. Donations went into an account used solely for meals given to children of deployed or recently returned military families. No forms, no questions, just dignity and a warm plate, no different from any other customer. It wasn't a charity, it was a promise. Sometimes Jenny would see a young face she didn't recognize sitting at Adam's booth. A tired mom across the table, a nervous kid clutching a book. And Jenny would slide over a plate of pancakes or eggs, maybe oatmeal with cinnamon, the same way she had all those mornings before. Quietly, kindly, without asking for anything. One morning, she noticed a small envelope beside the tip jar. Inside was a drawing, a crayon sketch of a plate of food and a smiling woman with an apron. Underneath it, in careful, uneven letters, were the words, "Thank you for feeding my mom and me. My dad is far away, but we're okay now." Jenny pinned it to the board beside the military patches, where it fluttered gently every time the door opened. A mission had formed, born not in policy, but in pancakes, not in headlines, but in hush, and it was hers to carry. Mark never made speeches. He wasn't the kind of man to call for meetings or pin mission statements to the wall. But he was observant, the kind of boss who noticed when a waitress's hands shook from exhaustion or when the napkin order came up short. He noticed the small things. He just never said much about them. Until now. It started subtly. One morning, Jenny found the pantry stocked with extra oatmeal, brown sugar, and fruit that hadn't been on the regular order. When she asked about it, Mark just shrugged. Thought it might be good to have options, for extras. Then came the shift in the till, an unspoken understanding that if a customer couldn't pay, the charge would quietly disappear. Jenny noticed receipts with blank totals, meal comps recorded with a discreet family meal on house written in the margins. It wasn't discussed, it was just done. And then, one Tuesday, he posted a new sign in the window. Small, cleanly printed, tucked just beneath the opening hours. "Whoever you are, whatever you can pay, no one leaves hungry." Jenny stood at the counter, reading it for a long moment. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't demand applause. But they echoed with the quiet heart of the place they represented. She turned to find Mark wiping down a table, his back to her. "You put up the sign?" she asked. He didn't look up. Seemed like it was time. Jenny walked over, apron in one hand, her throat thick with gratitude. "You've changed," she said softly. Mark glanced at her then, half smiling in that quiet, self-deprecating way he had. "Nah, I just finally caught up." He stood there for a moment, then added, Growing up, my old man used to chase off every neighborhood kid who showed up at our back door. Said if you fed one, you'd feed the whole street. Drove my mother crazy. But every now and then, she'd sneak a sandwich through the back gate anyway. Never said a word about it. I think I finally get it. He didn't wait for Jenny to respond. Just nodded toward the kitchen and headed back to the grill. But Jenny stood still, heart full, because the man who once warned her against giving away free meals had quietly rewritten the rules. Not for attention, not for image, but because kindness had taken root. The policy didn't have a name. There was no ribbon cutting or announcement. Just a sign in the window. And a new truth in the diner. Everyone eats. The governor arrived without a press team. No flashing cameras. No scheduled speeches. Just a sleek black sedan that pulled into Rosie's parking lot one sunny Thursday morning, flanked by a single state trooper and an aide who looked far too young to carry a briefcase that heavy. Jenny was behind the counter refilling the sugar caddies when she noticed the car. She didn't recognize it at first, just another polished vehicle that didn't quite belong in their dusty little corner of Kansas. But when the man stepped out, tall and composed, dressed in a navy suit with a subtle state pin on his lapel, the diner quieted. Even before he opened the door, people recognized him. Governor Charles Renner. Mark nearly dropped a plate. Kathy muttered something sharp under her breath. Jenny stood still, the tiny scoop of sugar trembling slightly in her hand. The bell above the door chimed. The governor entered, looked around the room like someone who'd been here before, in memory if not in person, then smiled. "I'm looking for Miss Jenny Millers," he said. Every head turned. Jenny stepped forward slowly, apron still tied, hands dusty with sugar. "I'm Jenny," she said, voice soft but steady. The governor approached and extended his hand. "It's an honor to meet you." She hesitated only a second before shaking it. "I didn't want to make this a media circus," he said, "but some stories deserve recognition, not because they went viral, but because they remind the rest of us what we've forgotten." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, polished wooden box. Inside was a medal engraved with the state seal and a simple inscription, "For uncommon service to the people of Kansas." "This is the highest civilian honor our state can give," he said. "It's usually reserved for major donors, educators, sometimes retired judges. But today, it belongs to a waitress who fed a child without asking his name." The room was silent. Even the usual clatter of dishes had stopped. Jenny's breath caught, and for a moment, she didn't move. She hadn't asked for any of this. But as she looked around, at the regulars, the veterans, the mother with 2 kids sharing pancakes at Adam's booth, she realized this moment wasn't just about her. It was about what her small acts had inspired. The governor pinned the medal gently to her apron, his voice quieter now. "You reminded people that kindness doesn't need permission, that feeding someone isn't charity, it's decency." Applause rose slowly, then gathered strength. Not loud, but heartfelt, from every booth, every corner. People stood, some clapped, some cried. Kathy wiped her eyes with the edge of a dish towel. Mark nodded once, his lips pressed tight against emotion he wouldn't show. Jenny didn't speak. She only smiled, hand resting gently on the medal, her eyes shining. She hadn't set out to change the world, but sometimes, when you feed just one hungry soul, the world changes anyway. The medal sat quietly behind the counter, tucked between a jar of honey packets and a framed photo of the diner from the 1960s. Jenny hadn't moved it to the wall or placed it under a spotlight. It wasn't that kind of honor. It wasn't meant for display. It was meant to be held in the heart. Life at Rosie's had settled into a new rhythm, steady and familiar. The regulars still came in before sunrise, The coffee still flowed like clockwork, and Jenny still wore the same apron with the stitched initials her mother had sewn in years ago. But there was something deeper now, woven into the fabric of the place. Adam's booth was never empty. Some days it was occupied by a quiet military family passing through town. Other days by a single mother and her child, invited in by a stranger who paid for their meal in advance. No one asked questions anymore. The plaque on the wall explained everything that needed saying. Coins and patches still arrived, slipped beneath napkin dispensers or handed over with quiet gratitude. The board behind the counter now held so many tokens they overlapped like scales, forming a shield of memory. New ones were added each week. Jenny never asked where they came from. She just smiled, pinned them up, and whispered, "Thank you." The fund for children of deployed parents continued to grow, fed by small donations, anonymous envelopes, and notes from across the country. A church group in Texas sent a check with the words "for the pancake lady" scribbled in the memo line. A class of 5th graders in Ohio held a bake sale and mailed the proceeds with a bundle of handwritten cards. Jenny kept every card, every letter, every small offering of thanks. Not because she needed the recognition, but because they proved something she'd always believed, deep down in the quiet parts of herself. Kindness doesn't disappear, it echoes. Sometimes she still thought of Adam, wondered if he was reading a new book, if he liked his new school, if he still looked for her in the small things. She hoped so. She hoped he knew she thought of him too. Always would. And on quiet mornings, before the first bell rang above the door, Jenny would pour herself a cup of coffee, sit for a moment at Adam's booth, and remember. Not the attention, not the medals, but the boy, the hunger, the unspoken thank yous. Because that was what mattered. One meal at a time, one child seen. One soul reminded they were not alone. She hadn't just fed a boy. She had built a legacy from pancakes and silence, and the world was still learning from it.